Hello everybody, it's me, the Excellent Reviewer, and I figured that since, we're still stuck inside, I figure that we take a look at one of the most disastrous UFC careers in MMA and UFC history, and that is CM Punk's UFC career. So without further ado, let's look into it. Now, we all know that CM Punk was the biggest star in WWE before leaving after months and months of being mistreated. We all know this. I'm sure lots of people were thinking that Punk would now go on to wrestle for other companies like Ring of Honor or maybe even New Japan. But CM Punk would not wrestle for any other company as he was now retired from pro wrestling altogether. On December 6, 2014, months after his retirement from WWE and pro wrestling, CM Punk had announced that he had signed a multi-fight deal with the UFC, to which he was met with immediate criticism from the MMA purists, saying that it was a bad decision and that ultimately he was going to be a lamb led to slaughter, especially with the fact that CM Punk had no prior MMA training or MMA fights at all under his belt, and he was starting his MMA debut at the age of 36, which is really late to start a career in mixed martial arts. UFC had a lot of promotion behind Punk and his first fight. They even gave him a documentary series on YouTube following him and his journey to his first fight. The one thing that you can say about CM Punk was the fact that he was really dedicated to his training, as he would drive 3 hours from his home to Chicago all the way to Wisconsin so that he could train before ultimately moving to Wisconsin so that he could be closer to training. And he was being trained by Duke Roufus, who is a world-renowned fighter, winning titles all over the world and training so many people that would go on to have success in the UFC. As Punk was training, more info would be given to us, like the fact that CM Punk would be fighting in the welterweight division, but for the longest time we had no idea who his opponent would be at all. But unfortunately, Punk got injured in October of 2015 during his training, which unfortunately meant that his fight would be delayed until 2016. Once he was healed up from injury, he would eventually be called out by Mickey Gall, and there were so many people that were gunning to fight Punk, but ultimately they gave Mickey Gall the go-ahead after he fought Mike Jackson and won the opportunity to fight CM Punk. And on February 6, 2016, it was officially set up for Punk versus Mickey Gall at September 2016's UFC 203. One of the reasons that they chose Mickey Gall was because at the time he only had one fight under his belt, and they felt as though that the skill levels between Punk and Gall were pretty even. And what came to a shock to everyone was the fact that CM Punk would be fighting on the main card and not on the pre-show. Ultimately, people were pissed off because CM Punk, who had no prior training, no fights under his belt, is on the main card, where on the main card only the elite level fighters should be fighting, not someone who is making his MMA debut. But aside from that, after months of delays and injuries, CM Punk was finally ready to fight in the UFC. Or was he? CM Punk, of course, comes out to Cult of Personality, and finally the time to show what Punk has learned is upon us, and within 7 seconds of the fight, he gets immediately taken down by Mickey Gall. And Gall starts hitting Punk with hard shots to the head. Punk, he got in a couple of shots, but Mickey Gall just stayed on Punk before choking him out with 2 minutes and 46 seconds left on the clock. Punk, he got destroyed, and there was no way that he could have survived that first round. But what did you expect from someone who had no MMA training at all in CM Punk, going up against a person who had legitimate boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training in Mickey Gall. Were you expecting an upset? Even though CM Punk lost his first fight in the UFC and he was heavily buried online by MMA purists and people who didn't like him from WWE, he was paid pretty well, as he made over $500,000 for his first fight. But according to CM Punk's wife, AJ Lee, due to the pay-per-view buys, he got another $500,000, making his total earnings being $1 million for his first fight, while Mickey Gall got paid a measly $30,000, and that includes his purse for winning the fight. So Punk was literally laughing his way to the bank. Punk, of course, was humbled that night, and you have to give him credit, because it's not easy to transition from one sport to another, and CM Punk, he gave it his all. And he stepped in the octagon and he got his ass kicked, but at least he was able to fight. Even though it was a gimmick fight, as no doubt Dana White wanted to capitalize on CM Punk's star power. And although he had no credibility in the UFC, many were completely surprised when CM Punk would get another chance to fight, this time against Mike Jackson, who had fought Mickey Gall previously to see who would go on to face Punk. It was announced on July 9th, 2018, Punk would have his second fight, this time in his hometown of Chicago at UFC 225, and Punk again was on the main card, while other more experienced fighters like Alistair Overeem were on the pre-show. 2 years after his UFC debut, he was about to step into his second UFC fight. And for Punk, this was a must-win situation, so that he could prove to himself and all the doubters that he belonged in the UFC. And as the fight begins, Punk goes after a leg kick, but he misses, and he spins around like a little top. Punk, he gets Jackson with a couple of kicks before Jackson attacks with a few of his own jabs. Punk gets Jackson up against the cage, and after a couple hits, also while delivering knee strikes, you can tell that Punk is just way more aggressive in this fight than he was in his last. Punk goes for a takedown but is ultimately denied, but you can tell that Punk is getting a little bit winded at this point, and his nose is already cut. The first round is at its closing moments when Punk scores a takedown and presumably wins the round. Already at this point, Punk has lasted longer than his first official fight. The second round of the fight starts, and you can just tell by watching the fight that Mike Jackson does not give a fuck, as it's written all over his face. CM Punk takes Jackson to the cage but is reversed, and Punk is bleeding now more than ever. And you can see he's already getting more and more tired. Punk goes for a guillotine choke, but is thrown down to the ground as Jackson is now on top of Punk. And Jackson, he starts toying with him about where he's gonna punch next. And the crowd does not like it at all. Punk goes for a triangle choke, but Jackson escapes, and the second round is now in the books. The third and final round comes, and CM Punk goes for a body lock but is put up against the cage. Punk tries to go for a takedown but is stopped. At one point, Punk stumbles and then goes for a takedown before getting hit with a punch that lands Punk on the ground by Mike Jackson. Jackson allows Punk to stand up after being knocked down, and as Punk gets up, he starts throwing punches, but none of them connect. At one point, Punk tries to go toe-to-toe with Mike Jackson, who's a trained boxer. Which, why would you do that? You're gonna get murdered. Jackson takes down Punk, and he keeps him down for pretty much the entirety of the round until the bell rings, and CM Punk's second fight comes to an end. And what came as a surprise was the fact that Punk hugged Jackson after the fight. I figured that he would have been pissed the way that Jackson was toying with him, but oh well. The official decision was made as Mike Jackson came out on top of that fight, and CM Punk is handed his second loss in UFC. Punk should have undoubtedly been on the pre-show, but once again, showered by hate from the MMA purists and fighters alike, he laughed his way to the bank again, as his second fight earned him another $500,000, while Mike Jackson only got $23,500 for the fight. Dana White was not happy at Mike Jackson toying around with CM Punk and not giving a flying fuck, and he said that he is 0-2 in my opinion, and that he won't fight for the UFC again. And when asked if CM Punk will fight in the UFC again, Dana White said that he should probably give it a wrap, at least in UFC, and that's pretty much what Punk has seemingly done, as he hasn't fought in another promotion or in the UFC since losing his second fight in the UFC. Although CM Punk currently works as a commentator for Cage Fury Fighting Championships, which is a company affiliated with the UFC, and of course, he works with Fox Sports on WWE Backstage. And that covers the extent of CM Punk's UFC career. So CM Punk's career was a massive failure beyond any belief in the UFC, but you have to give the guy credit. He dedicated his time and effort to being a fighter. He drove 3 hours every day just to train before he decided to move closer to his training facility. He worked his ass off, and yes, he got his ass kicked, but at least he was able to step into the octagon and actually fight, as opposed to so many people who just talk a big game and never go through with it. The main takeaway from CM Punk's UFC run was the fact that he loved MMA and he gave it his all. Like we're all trying to do with the things, whether we want to be a professional wrestler, a writer, a dancer, or whatever have you. And how can you knock a guy who was just trying to achieve his dream?